Thank you so much for having me. Can you hear me okay? Or should I speak louder? Okay, great. Thank you for that introduction, Christina, and thank you for the invitation to join you for this seminar. So I want to just acknowledge my colleagues, Mika Tomir and Fusbuju, who are part of this broader project that is funded by the National Institute of Aging, that's looking at parent-child relationships across the life course, including pathways to childbearing and their midlife effects. So kind of trying to look at them, the consequences of childbearing later in the life course. And this piece comes from that. The parent-child tie is incredibly enduring. It is one of the longest lasting relationships we have, second only to siblings, just due to their co-occurrent lifespans, and can be incredibly beautiful, helpful, loving, full of support, full of resource giving in both directions. And I feel like it's really important to say that and to talk about family estrangement because we're about to go in the other direction. But I want to acknowledge that, of course, for many people, this bond is one of the most important, not only for well-being, but also general life chances across the life course. And really, this is the focus of my first book, Families We Keep, which focuses on, as Christina said, LGBTQ adults and their parents. In that book, I interview LGBTQ adults and their parents about how and why they stay in relationship with one another, despite often conflict in those relationships. But in the course of my research for that book, there were a few people who did estrange from a parent for a period of time. And this really got me thinking, what about the dark side of these relationships? What happens when these relationships aren't supportive, loving, and resource giving as we would hope that they would be? And this brings me to thinking about estrangement as a thing that we should be talking about in family demography. Of course, we know that parents and their adult children people can have conflict with relationships between parents and adult children. They can also end, these ties can end. When we're thinking about estrangement, there's lots of ways that we can measure estrangement. I'm going to give you one way that we're measuring it based kind of on the data that we have available to us. But typically we're talking about estrangement is having no contact at all between the generations or low contact with very low levels of closeness. The reason we keep the low contact and low levels of closeness as opposed to just saying no contact is because we know that, mobility across the, people don't move very far from their parents. This is what I'm trying to say. So people may need to stay in contact with parents due to other reasons, but still have an estranged relationship with them that is kind of full of conflict or low levels of closeness. And we could talk about how to think about that in the Q&A if you'd like. We also know that people move in and out of no and low contact. So being estranged isn't necessarily a static state. And it's not in this talk, but I can talk about what we call unestrangement. So people go into estrangement and then come out of estrangement later. But in this talk, I want to think about estrangement as an exposure, meaning that it can be something like a stressor that one is exposed to, similar to one might be exposed to divorce, right? You don't always stay divorced, but you might remarry, but it's still an exposure that might have impact on health across the life course. And so we're kind of testing that here with the second part of this talk. We also know that adult children are the most likely to initiate no or low contact estrangement. And I'm not going to be able to talk as much about that today. In my second book that's focused on interview data with estranged people, I'll talk more about this initiation idea. But it is important when we get to the second part of the talk where I'm talking about the health implications of estrangement, because it's going to matter who initiates estrangement for the health impacts of this exposure. And originally, quantitatively, I don't have that information, but I think theoretically we want to keep that in mind. It doesn't mean that parents don't estrange their adult children. They do, absolutely. But more likely than not, adult children are the ones who are initiating estrangement. Okay, so I was doing this book. I was talking to people who kept relationships between parents and their adult children. And these few people had estranged ties. So it just got me thinking, I need to start looking at this, what is going on? How are we talking about estrangement in the current moment? And one of the things that I always like to do is look at the sort of media discourse that's happening around a topic to get a sense of where people are in the broader landscape. And what I found was something that as a social demographer, I found completely interesting. most of the media in the last 5 years, the stories about family estrangement or going no contact have framed estrangement as something of an epidemic. This framing of an epidemic, so interesting. A silent epidemic, a modern day epidemic. And not only that, but a growing epidemic. Estrangement or no contact is this growing phenomenon that's happening. We're panicking over this. Can you, right? This is how the media is framing it. Of course, I go to the scientific literature on the topic. And do I find any evidence of a growing phenomenon? I don't. Not because it's not, because we have no data on this. There is very little data on, on the basic prevalence rate of estrangement. I thought this was really interesting. And this is the sort of first thing I'm going to talk about today. So I'm going to talk about measuring estrangement and then the basic prevalence rate of estrangement in the United States today. As I started talking, I did some podcasts on estrangement, and I was talking to a New York Times reporter who was doing a story on estrangement. She was specifically doing a story about TikTok being an influence in adult children going no contact with their parents. So we had this like hour-long conversation, telling her about the data or lack thereof. And about a month later, I get an email from her, and she said, has anything come out in the last month on, how estrangement is growing in prevalence? I was like, no, no, nothing has come out in the last month that's different than the last month I talked to you. And she said, well, that's kind of a problem for me. And I said, that's interesting. So clearly there's a desire to frame this as a growing phenomenon, but the data isn't there. So my effort here in collaboration with my colleagues is to try to get a basic understanding of, in the United States, what is the prevalence rate? I'm not even touching the answer of growing over time. And you as social demographers probably know why. That is very hard to do, and we're working on it. But right now, we just need what's happening today. So I'm going to give you a little bit of insight into that. So despite this media framing, we're going to talk about prevalence. The second thing I saw in the sort of broader media conversation was that estrangement is bad. And I think that this is, and this is just a random amount of, number of them saying how bad estrangement is for parents, for children, psychologically, clearly is the main thing, but also we could think about physical health problems, these kinds of things, especially if we're thinking about an aging population, who's taking care of aging parents if their children are estranging from them. This could be a big social problem. You have David Brooks here on the right saying, what's ripping families apart? In this piece, he is talking about estrangement, and he says, I think estrangement is a piece of what seems to be the psychological unraveling of America. So estrangement is becoming a source of serious social panic, one of the family panics that we might consider that we go through periodically about the changing nature of our family structure. And that's why, as a social demographer, I'm really interested in it, the potential implications. I don't, feel the same way, but I think it's an empirical question we could ask. Once again, I'm not asking that big question in this empirical talk. We could talk about whether or not it's ripping families apart and therefore our society. But in general, the second part of this talk, I'm going to be looking at the health consequences of estrangement. So if we know something about prevalence, what do we know about how estrangement might matter for health and well-being? And I'm going to theoretically motivate the second part of the talk a little bit later, once we get through the prevalence question. Okay, so defining and measuring estrangement. I will say that this data is, like many of our national data sets, pretty gender binary. So in this case, we're looking at the prevalence of maternal and paternal estrangement from an adult child. And this is people who identify this person as their mother or father. So they're not, this is kind of like self-identifying. This is my mother, this is my father, I'm going to track estrangement from them. So the reports are from adult children. I'll talk about the data in a second. Then I'm going to give you some very basic sort of rates of prevalence across 3 social locations: gender, sexuality, and race ethnicity. Okay, let me tell you about the data. The data is the NLSY 79, and it's linked child and young adult supplement. So the NLSY 79 one of the reasons we could look at potentially change over time across cohorts is because the NLS are cohort, like they're part of a broader cohort data, right? So we have mature women files. We have lots of other different ways we could look at it. We're kind of trying to map this question, although of course we don't have the same measures of parent-child relationships across these data sets, so it's actually quite challenging. But for the meantime, we're looking at the NLSY 79. So the NLSY 79 is adults who currently are about age 60. They range from age 50 to 60 currently in the latest wave. And then once the child reached age 15, they actually entered into their own survey. So we have parent survey, and then we also have as many adult children as we possibly can. So that allows us to look at some family level data, and I will show you some of that data, although of course we have attrition issues going on with the multiple siblings and multiple children. So this has relationship data specifically from the adult children. So once the adult children, I guess I'm calling them adult, but 15 isn't quite adult. Once they reach 15, it's called the young adult file. They get their own survey, and they are surveyed then every 2 years until they reach the age of 30, when they're interviewed every 4 years or every other wave. This is a problem with the funding of the data. It's run out of the BLS, and there's some issues with the data, but that's the way it goes, right? So we got what we got, and so we are tracking them over time. Right now, I'm just going to talk about this as a sort of across these waves, how many people experience exposures to estrangement as part of the prevalence. Okay, so how do we measure estrangement? So we did it a bunch of different ways, and this is what we landed on based on how other people were talking about prevalence of estrangement. So we think again about estrangement as an exposure, where adult children are reporting any wave of estrangement, exposure to estrangement for at least one wave from 15 on. And this is, estrangement can be two things, and it's kind of like I mentioned before. So the first one is basically no contact. Seeing or talking to a parent not at all, or about once or less, a year or less, regardless of closeness. So no matter how close they rate their relationship, which they will still rate it, we say if you didn't have contact, then you are included in the estrangement measure. And as I mentioned, we also are including this low contact estrangement. So we include seeing or talking to a parent about once a year or less, or several times a year, and not being very close, suggesting disruption in ties. In the second part of the talk, I will also talk a little bit more about socially negative ties and include that in this conversation. But for now, this is our measure of estrangement. And this is, pretty simple stuff, looking at first chi-square test, and I'll just breeze through this as quickly as I can. And then we use logistic regression to estimate these associations by gender, race, ethnicity, and sexuality for mothers and fathers. So the first part of the talk, just getting a sense of what's going on in terms of estrangement prevalence. So again, we're talking about basically midlife parents and their adult children. And of course, those adult children are different ages, right? So people have different timings of fertility. So we have some more data on some adult children than others. These people are not, some of the adult children are still in their late teens and early 20s. So we have yet to have this fully fleshed out yet, just as a caveat. We're not looking back and looking at prevalence rates. So we do have, so of course, covariates in the full model. So we have gender, race, ethnicity, sexual identity, which I'll talk about. It was only asked in one wave. So I even feel uncomfortable kind of talking about sexual identity as it's only asked in one wave. We're retrospectively applying it to people, but it is what it is. And then we have birth year, educational attainment, employment status. These are all the child variables. Again, we have two data sets that are linked. And then we have parental variables with the controls here. So birth year, we talk about co-residence status of mother and father. This is important because some of the literature suggests that people who are divorced are more likely to be estranged, especially from fathers. We have whether they were ever married, education, employment status, and in general, their independent marital history. Meaning, did they remarry if they were divorced, or did they repartner if they ended their primary relationship that was originally in this child's relationship? We also have child's marital status and parental status. And we plan to look at some of those as predictors of estrangement a little bit later, right? There's reasons to suggest that marital status, parental status, and employment status might relate to the likelihood of estrangement. So TBD on that. Okay, as a reminder, first, we're looking at the prevalence of maternal and paternal estrangement. Theoretically speaking, as I just mentioned, there's good reason to suggest that paternal estrangement is going to be higher than maternal estrangement. We could think about this in terms of the gendered norms of parenting, who does more parenting, who does more and longer legs at parenting. We have the parental divorce issue and particularly for this generation where children are much more likely to reside with mothers than they are fathers. We have non-residential fatherhood. We have the fact that fathers may be removed from the family due to incarceration. And so there's lots of reasons, more likely to be, lots of reasons why we might see paternal estrangement at higher rates than maternal estrangement. And that's basically what we find. This is the full table, but I'm going to shorten it for you. So give me a second so you can have a chance at seeing it potentially. So this is the prevalence estimates of parent-child estrangement. This right here is, I just cut off the bottom of it just to show you these this basic table, so you can see that the pink bar for mothers. So mothers is here where the pink bar is. Well, that does not work. Okay, so mothers, we see that there's not, 6.7. We see, and you can see it by gender too, but I'll show you the regression models for the gender finding. And for fathers, it's much higher. So we have, as we would expect, fathers having higher prevalence of estrangement. Now, what's interesting about this is that they have to have a relationship with the father in order to be estranged. So it can't be that they never had a relationship with the father and this is accounting for that, but they had to have report of some relationship with the father prior to being in the survey. So that's this basic prevalence rate. And then we can look at estrangement rates that vary by gender, sexuality, and race ethnicity. So these are the logistic regression results predicting estrangement from mothers and fathers. And you can see here, so we can see that women are more likely to be estranged from fathers than our sons. What is this finding? And I wish I had time to theoretically motivate all of these, but I'm going to go through them anyway. We see that Black adults are less likely to be estranged from their mothers than our white adults. And we did run significance tests across groups, and there was no other significant effects. And we also see that Black and Hispanic or Latinx children are more likely to be estranged from their fathers than our white children, adult children. And this is again consistent with thinking about, in particular, Black feminist family literature that suggests that mothers are particularly embedded in the family structure, and due to potential other factors, structural racism in particular, Black men may be, and Hispanic men may be less likely to be embedded in family. And this might extend into midlife. Okay, so here's our really tricky data on the gay, lesbian, and bisexual data. This is, again, a much smaller sample size, so I'm less convinced about, not necessarily the findings, because it's very consistent with the literature that suggests that gay and lesbian and bisexual people are less embedded in the family, who have stronger ties to chosen family or fictive kin that might exist outside of their family of origin. And basically what we find is that there is a higher rate of estrangement for gay, lesbian, and bisexual people relative to heterosexual people for only fathers. So it's only a father effect. And we might theorize this has to do with norms of masculinity and the ways in which fathers may reject their gay, lesbian, and bisexual children. That's speculation, not endorsed by this data, but really informed again by other research. And I have some quotes that I added at the end that I don't think we'll have time for, but that reflect this idea, basically, that in this case, fathers are more likely to reject their children due to their gender and sexual nonconformity. So I think that's really, really important to remember. Okay, so this is just one of the first studies that's looking at these prevalence rates. We need way more information on this from other data sources because the NLSY is limited, of course, in all ways that all data sources are, and we don't necessarily have a good sense of prevalence across cohorts. So this is my pitch. to have people join this research area because we need more on this topic. But for the sake of time, let me move into the second portion of the talk. So let's think about the health consequences of estrangement. So of course, the media discourse suggests that estrangement is going to be bad. I think overall, we could agree that there is high stigmatization for estrangement. Estrangement is not something that we talk a lot about. And in the United States, it's something that we really kind of push back against, right? These notions of honor your mother and father, and are pretty pervasive. This is something I'm talking about in my next book on family estrangement. So I want to understand, is estrangement related to maternal health? How is it related to child health? And then I'm going to touch on the sibling and multiple children context because we have the data for NLSY. I'm going to attempt to parse it out. It's pretty complicated, but I think we can do it. Okay, so again, we're looking at estranged people. Estranged means no contact or no contact, low closeness. The same measure for estrangement that we used with the prevalence previous part of the talk. But we added two sort of different, we added two other groups. Why do we do this? Well, as a family demographer and somebody who has studied marriage and divorce for a really long time, the literature on marriage and divorce follows a similar trend as this estrangement literature. In this body of work, right, when divorce started to rise in the 1970s and 80s, people, of course, panicked. And we had these same like rhetorics around the fall of the family, of course. But research that came out of this era said, actually, divorce is not great for you, right? But a bad marriage is also not great for you. And so that literature came up with theoretical perspectives that suggest that if you have a good marriage, that's best for your health. If you have a bad marriage, that's pretty bad for your health. And if you get divorced, that's, maybe better for your health than if you stay in a bad marriage. So we're following that same line of thinking in this estrangement literature. And so what we do is we're also following this other like social positive, social negative framing that is in the social ties literature more broadly to say we want to compare estranged people not only to socially positive people, that is people who have high closeness, basically, both those measures, right? Low contact, high closeness, high contact, high closeness. Those are probably good relationships. You have high level of closeness. We expect that those would be the best relationships for your health. But then we also wanted to add the social negative tie. These are relationships that have high contact and low closeness. And much like we would suggest a low quality marriage might be bad for your health relative to divorce, we might suggest that a socially negative relationship might be just as bad for your health, if not worse, than ending that relationship. And so that's kind of like the motivation that we're thinking about. This is, again, the same measurement strategy. So we're looking at the adult child surveys beginning when the child is 15 until the current wave, and same structure there. So we have here, we're only focusing on moms, and I should have said this earlier, because the dad's data falls out. And I'm so bummed about this because we absolutely need more information on this for the dad's perspective. But today I'll just talk about the mom's perspective. There's little things about NLSY data that's tricky. Okay, so let me just reiterate this theoretical framing of thinking about it in terms of the marriage and divorce literature. And these are pulled right from that framework. So the first sort of theoretical framing we might have is estrangement is bad and it's worse than any other relationship category, socially positive and socially negative, because you lose resources. So of course, the parent-child tie, perhaps especially to adult children who are entering into adulthood, who are entering into a tough labor market, right? We have various things, other things going on. So we may suggest that there's a resource loss from estrangement. If you stay in the tie, if you're in a socially negative tie, and it's kind of terrible, but at least you have a place to live, probably better for your health than estrangement. So from this theoretical perspective, we're suggesting that if you are estranged, it's worse for your health than the socially negative and the socially positive ties. The second theoretical perspective that we're pulling on is the stress and stigma of estrangement. I just mentioned that estrangement is fairly stigmatized in the United States. Still, people do not want to talk about it. And so we suggest that, especially for moms, because the maternal social role is so important, that is having an estranged tie with an adult child is going to actually be pretty bad because of the stigma that is associated with it and the emotional loss that comes with, thinking that you're going to be in a relationship with the child that you raised for however many years. That is a big loss. So we think that might be especially challenging for moms. And then the third perspective, again, coming from the divorce literature, would suggest that an intact but bad relationship would be the worst for health. So or at least equivalent to estrangement. And so we theorize that estrangement and socially negative ties will both be worse than socially positive ties. So I think it's hard to argue, like socially positive ties, those are going to be good. We want those. But any other relationship, regardless of estrangement or socially negative, is bad. So we use the same basic approach, except for we are adding, the sibling models that I just mentioned. These are a little bit tricky. Partly we had sample size issues, and I'll show you the estranged. You already know that estranged mother-child prevalence is pretty low. So we had some sample size issues, and what we decided to do is combine the estranged or socially negative just for the sibling models. And you'll see when I get to the child models, there's so many categories that it was just really hard to figure it out. So I'll show you. It'll make more sense when we get to that point. But for this part of the model, we look at estranged or socially negative. So that means basically people who don't have contact or have low closeness are in one group, and the socially positive are in another. So we're kind of combining our categories just for the sibling models. And we also have some ideas about what might be happening for siblings. So Jill Suter and Carl Pilmer's groups talk a lot about thinking about cumulative effects for negative relationships. So it might be that if you have multiple children who you are, estranged from or have negative relationships from, that's going to be the worst for your health. That makes a lot of sense. Then if you just have one in that group. For children, we think we have kind of two hypotheses. It might be protective for children who are estranged to have another sibling who's estranged, right? You might have solidarity. You might be able to address some of those resource losses. And so that might actually be good for you. It might also be that there's a ripple effect. So if you are in a family and your sibling is estranged, that might come in to your own well-being, right? You're like, oh, I'm seeing the negative effects of the strain that's happening around me, and that might be bad for me. So we're kind of testing these different hypotheses. There's more we could test with the siblings, but I'll get to that when we jump into that model. Okay. So we test this with psychological distress, CESD score, and self-rated health. We dichotomize self-rated health. I'm going to show you the self-rated health findings. They're very consistent across these two. I just felt like it would be too much to show both. I do have them if you want to see them. There's some in the maternal model, some differences by psychological distress, but they're pretty consistent. And for the children, they're completely identical. So I'm going to focus on the self-rated health. I do think there are different mechanisms that might be shaping health, of course, between psychological distress, CESD, and self-rated health. So, we're kind of like testing which matters, and we find that both have an effect. We add some controls in this portion of the paper. So we're looking at mom's birth year, race, education, marital status at child's birth, any period of divorce prior to child turning 5, and maternal depression. That's at 1992, so we're kind of trying to track that early. And then the child, we add more variables from the child, and we add in some of the mom's variables for the child's model. So these are two separate models, and we're adding some of the mom's variables in the child models because we think that those are probably going to matter in this relationship. So for example, we're using maternal marital status at the child's birth, the mother's marriage that ended prior to age 15. So trying to just like see if we can kind of make sure that we're capturing these various components that will likely have relationship with both estrangement and, of course, health outcomes. Okay, so no surprise, we're using the same data set. So this is the NLSY 79 and the NLSY 79 young adults. Slightly smaller sample size because of the controls that we're adding. So it just reduces it slightly for these models. Then the prevalence rate, we were able to capture more people. we use logistic regression and OLS regression to, and then I'm going to show you the predicted probabilities for fair, poor health, and the predicted values of the depression symptoms, which I have at the end if we want to look at those. And we use pairwise comparisons to based on the regression coefficients. And then, yes, okay, so let me show you. There's a descriptive table that I'm sure the people in the back cannot see. The main thing I want to show you here is just this the pink box. So I was actually a little bit surprised at the socially negative group and how big it was. But I was not pleasantly surprised to hear that so many people have socially negative relationships. But from my perspective, it was helpful to have a big group that was in this category. And so there's a fair amount of people who are experiencing these high contact ties, but low levels of quality. And so that's important for us to think about. And there's other things that we could talk about in relationship to this table. We can go back to it in the Q&A if you would like to. Okay, so let me just show you the predicted probability of mothers' fair poor health, and I'll talk you through this. So I tried as best I could to keep the colors consistent across these predicted probabilities. We have orange here. I keep trying to use this pointer and it does not work. We have orange, that is the estranged group. We have yellow, which is the socially negative group. And again, this is moms. And we have the green, which is the socially positive group. Okay. So we have a stair-step pattern, and you can see, I've tried to articulate it through the boxes, but basically what we see is that for moms, estrangement, higher values, of course, are worse for fair poor health. So estranged people have worse fair poor health than the two other groups. So they have worse self-rated health than the socially negative group, and they have worse self-rated health than the socially positive group. What we thought was interesting, so this is consistent with the first hypothesis, right, or the first theoretical framework. It wasn't really a hypothesis, the first theoretical framework that suggests that, for moms, so if being estranged is worse than being in a bad relationship, and this bears out to moms. We also see, though, that being in a socially negative relationship is worse than being in a socially positive relationship. So there is still, right, a negative consequence for being in a low, close relationship relative to being a socially positive one. But for moms, being in a socially negative relationship is better than being estranged. So this suggests, again, the sort of strain or perhaps the stigma of estrangement can be negatively associated with poor health over and above just having a bad relationship. Okay, I'm going to show you all of mom's children. Okay, it's somewhat similar, but quite a little bit different. So the green is all of the ties are socially positive. So all of the children that we have in the data are socially positive for the mom. Okay, so the mother level. The blue is mixed, and that means that there's some of their children are all socially positive, and some of their children are estranged, and some of their children are socially negative. Either or for that second group. And then the yellow is they're all estranged or socially negative. So all the mom's kids are in that negative group. And again, we have here, this is mom's fair poor health. So the higher values say worse fair and poor health. So worse health. So what we see is that having all your children in an estranged in the estranged group is bad for your health, right? It's worse health. But we also, kind of see that the mixed group is different than the all positive. So all socially positive is better off than both those other groups. Right? So this sort of multiple children being estranged, one child being estranged, or multiple children, all children being estranged maybe doesn't matter as much. If one child is estranged, then that's bad for mom's health. Okay, for the adult child's health, we see something different. So remember that moms when it came to moms who had socially positive children, a child that was in the socially positive category, they had a stair-step pattern where being estranged was the worst, socially negative was the second worst, and socially positive was the best. For adult children, we don't see that same pattern. We see that estrangement is worse than being socially positive, but we also see the socially negative is worse than the socially positive. So what this suggests is there's something different going on for the adult children, that there is no difference between being estranged and in a socially negative relationship for adult children. So whether they leave the relationship or whether they stay in the relationship, this impact on the fair and poor health is consistent. So of course, again, the best thing to be is the socially positive tie, but that third idea that maybe being in a bad relationship is bad for your health, no matter if you leave or stay, that is consistent for only the adult children. So only the adult children have that. Okay. And then finally, looking at the siblings. This will be overwhelming, and I promise you it's not as complicated as it looks. So for the siblings, so we're looking at the probability of children's fair or poor health. Again, same. We're looking at the higher bars, suggest that higher numbers suggest worse health. And I'm going to break it down to put you in two categories. So here, these two, okay, these are all socially positive or in this group. So that means you're not estranged. The respondent's not estranged. And this is the sibling only is estranged. So you're not estranged in these two groups. These two groups are the best off. So it's really your estrangement, right? You're not estranged here. In these, three groups, you are estranged. So you are estranged. And for the yellow, you're estranged only. You don't have a sibling estranged. For the green, you're estranged only, and you might have a sibling that is estranged. And in the blue, everybody in your family is estranged. They don't differ from each other. So these are all not statistically different, but these three are different than these two. So what this suggests is that it's your estrangement that matters, that the sibling estrangement doesn't have a relationship to your self-rated health, which is different than what we expected. We expected that there would be some differences. Okay, so I'm going to kind of go back through and summarize some of the findings in this section. So for moms, we think that the resource loss probably matters, that it probably is about maybe some resource loss, especially at that midlife stage when, mothers might be needing help, maybe with their physical health limitations. Again, for moms, we think probably more likely there is the stress and stigma of estrangement. And for kids, it really is this sort of estrangement or socially negative tie is bad for health, and they're both worse than close ties. What are the implications of this? This means that we can't necessarily just say that estrangement is bad, right? We can't take this notion that, leaving the family is the worst choice, at least from the perspective of the adult children. Because from the perspective of the adult children, there is suffering in both cases, right? The health is worse in both cases. So we might kind of put a little caveat on this fear of estrangement. It might be the bad relationship. We know it is. That is causing the harm for the adult children. Whereas for moms, the estrangement is worse than the bad relationship. For the siblings, we find that any child who's estranged is health detrimental. And this kind of goes with you're only as happy as, the saying is you're only as happy as your least happy child. And in this case, it might be you're only as happy as your least happy relationship, or you're only as well off as your least happy relationship. So it doesn't matter if, for the moms, necessarily if you have multiple children who are estranged, just one is enough. It is enough to get under the skin. For children, it's again one's own relationship that matters. So a sibling being estranged, but not you, doesn't seem to matter for your self-rated health or your psychological distress, which again, we looked at both. Okay, so there's still more questions that have yet to be answered. I opened this talk talking about this growing rate of prevalence. I don't answer that question here. I'm just offering you some new data on the prevalence rate. But I invite us to ask that question, to really kind of come at this with the skills that we have to look at estrangement as a social category that we engage and look at the prevalence rate, so we can be very clear about what's going on. There's a typo in this. Is disconnection always bad for health? I saw this early this morning when I was going over it. So how can we support estrangement so it is not damaging? We don't want it to be damaging. So how do we support estrangement so it can be less damaging for health? Yes, definitely. So, right, we could think about this again through the lens of divorce and the sort of social disruption around divorce. Like, it's not always bad. It can actually be very protective for us to end relationships that aren't good. We have to think about structure in how it might matter in estrangement's prevalence and effects. I also encourage us to think about these other unearthed dark sides of social ties. So how do we think about the sort of maintenance of relationships that maybe aren't as positive for us or our well-being? And the final thing that I want to just point to is the need to have attention to how we're using reference categories and measurement refinement in relationship to reference categories. Most of the literature to date says, oh, estrangement is bad for you because, relative to just everyone else. We have to parse out what is the everyone else. Those relationships are really complex. And so we need to think more carefully about who we're comparing estranged people to. And the measurement issue is an ongoing debate. So how we think about the measurement of this particular idea is open, and it's part of the ongoing conversation. There is a sort of no contact movement that's happening in this moment. And so I think we as social scientists need to kind of get ahead of this and really be able to mark how do we measure it. Okay, thank you.